Previously on this home renovation series, I built a half panel feature wall that worked as a bedhead. I used stunning fluted panels on the wall, added a shelf on top, and then painted the whole thing a stunning blue. This is how it turned out. Now here we are in episode 5, the most awaited video of the series, the kitchen transformation. In this video, I'm going to show you step by step how I transformed this kitchen for only $2,000. So let's dive into it.
Now the kitchen is currently in the state that it was as it was left by the tenants. You'll see that it is really dirty, really disgusting, and the cabinets are actually full of mouse poo. I have no idea how anybody can actually live in this state, but the previous tenants clearly didn't clean out their cupboards for a very long time. What I'm going to do in the kitchen is I'm going to try and keep as much of the original as I possibly can, but still completely transform the feel of the kitchen and make it look as fresh and modern as possible. The bench tops are actually in pretty good condition, so these laminate bench tops are going to stay. Now the cabinetry is also all laminate and it is in pretty good condition. So I'm going to paint all of the inside of the cupboards. I'm then going to take the doors off and add some DIY shaker style cabinetry. So I'm going to be adding a frame on the front of the laminate doors and then painting all of those doors. We're then going to rip out the old tile splashback and we're going to put in a new tile splashback because that's going to really dramatically improve the look and feel of this kitchen. Then it's going to be painted. We're going to be painting the wood frames and making them all high gloss white, the same with on the pantry. We are going to put in some new appliances. So the dishwasher is going to be replaced and also the cooktop is going to need to be replaced. But the idea is that we give this kitchen an entirely new feel, but not having to rip out and start again.
So let's take a little bit of a closer look at the kitchen and what the condition was when I first started. The first thing you'll notice is that quite a few of the hinges are broken and the doors are hanging off. And then inside the cabinets, the cupboards are just full of all this mouse poo and they're just so dirty. Look, they're not damaged by any stretch of the imagination, but it just needs a really good scrub and a really good deep clean. This is the old dishwasher that is going to be removed. And we're just going to replace that with a new stainless steel dishwasher, and you'll be able to see that the trim on the windows is also really dirty and just needing a really good deep clean. The sink, although it is quite dirty, is in fairly good condition, so I'm going to do a really good clean of that also, and then we're going to be keeping this original sink. The tiles just scream 90s home to me with these dated pictures, and the whole look and feel of the tiles really just drags the kitchen down and just dates the entire kitchen. I had two options available to me to deal with these tiles. The first, which was to just paint the original tiles, and the second, which was to rip them out and then install all new tiles. When it comes to this, I mean, the cost of both of them was very similar because the cost of the actual tiles is quite low. When it comes to tiling, the main component of that is the labor and the time it takes to install them. Whereas painting them, the cost of the paint would have been similar, but it would have been much quicker than installing the new tiles. I'm just going to paint all of the inside of the pantry, and then this oven is going to be staying because the oven is actually fairly new. It's only a couple of years old, but it just needs a really good deep clean to get rid of all of the grime in there. On this side of the kitchen, we're going to rip out these tiles and just replace it with plaster because you don't really need tiles on this side because really all that anybody's going to put there is probably a kettle and a toaster. This bin cupboard was extremely dirty and it just all needed to be thrown away and fixed up and painted. The first thing that I needed to do before I could do anything else in this kitchen was to give it a really good clean. I started out with the window because I decided the easiest thing for me to get started with was painting this window frame white. So I grabbed out a scrubber and a degreaser and I scrubbed all around the outside of the window frame and also in all of the grooves of the window sliders to make sure that there was no mold or grime in there. Because the kitchen is the space where we do a lot of cooking and there's a lot of fats and oils, generally speaking, when you're doing any painting in a kitchen, you need to do a really good deep clean with a degreaser multiple times because you'll be surprised by how much of that does actually stick to the surfaces in the kitchen. If you don't do the cleaning properly, you'll find that as soon as you start to try and paint anything in the kitchen, it's not going to stick properly and you're not going to get the desired results that you're wanting from the paint. Once the cleaning was all done, I just grabbed out a paintbrush and my primer, which is a 3-in-1 primer, and I'm just going to paint that on to this entire windowsill and then let that dry. I then moved on to painting the frames around the rest of the kitchen, so here around the pantry door and then also along all of the kickboards on the other side of the kitchen. Once again, I had to make sure that I did a really good deep clean of this window trim before I did the painting, especially of this trim around the pantry door because it is right next to the cooktop and range hood, and there was a lot of fat that had been splattered onto this wooden trim. We are going to be replacing the floor anyways, so I wasn't worried about getting paint on the floor. And generally when I am painting, I tend to paint the edges of the trim first and then paint the walls afterwards because I find it much easier to cut in from the wall side and then cut in right up against that edge without using any masking tape. Next up, I needed to remove all of the doors off the hinges. I'm going to be taking the door fronts back to my house and I'm going to be painting those door fronts at my house because I can set them all up on trestle tables in my garage and paint them a little bit easier. When removing the doors, I needed to make sure that I numbered them so that I would easily be able to put the cabinetry back together because the doors were specifically made to go in a particular spot, and if I don't put the same door back on the same hinge in the same spot, the kitchen's not going to go together very nicely. For these particular hinges, I needed to take the door off from the hinge on the door side, but keep the hinge attached to the cabinetry because if I tried to remove that, then when I put the hinges back on, the doors are not going to line up and there's going to be a little bit of a gap or they may start hitting. So it was just easier to leave the hinge attached to the cabinetry. If you're worried about leaving the hinges on when painting the cabinetry, you can always just put masking tape on those hinges. Or you can remove them. There's nothing to say that you can't remove them. Just make sure that you remember which hinge goes in which hole so that you put each hinge directly back in the same spot that you got it from. Time for some demolition work. Before I did anything here with demolition, I had the electrician come in and check in behind these tiles to make sure that there was nothing in the wall that I was going to cut when I removed the tiles. They also removed the power points and the MBN connection point and then just sealed off all of those wires. I cut the plaster out with the multi-tool and then just pulled those sheets off the wall. Once all the demolition work had been completed, it was then time to put the kitchen back together again. I got some plaster sheets and then I just cut those down to size, measured out the spaces where I needed to put them and made sure I cut them to the right length. Making sure to double check and triple check my measurements so that I wasn't going to cut them too short or too big. If you are a little bit worried with your measurements, always go on the bigger side because you can always make it smaller, but you can't easily make it bigger again. Once the panels were all cut down to size and with the right length, I needed to cut the hole for where the power point was going to go so they could bring the wires back through. So I just used a hole saw to put a hole in that section. I then grabbed out this special drill bit which is designed for installing plaster sheets so that it recesses the screws back into the plaster a little bit and it's going to be flush. I put the glue onto all of the studs in the wall and then applied the sheet to the wall before screwing it into place. You need to know where the studs are, so if you're not going to remember where the studs are, just put a pencil line on the front of the plaster sheet so that you can drill with those screws directly into the studs and the frame of the house. Once the plaster sheets were all installed, I decided to add the waterproofing primer and a little bit of waterproofing along here, along the bench line, just because when you're using the kitchen sink, you can get a little bit of water onto the bench. And if it does happen to sit there on the bench, it's then not going to absorb through the tiles into the plaster wall. From my understanding here in Australia, waterproofing the kitchen is not a requirement, but I thought it was a good addition to do because I had the waterproofer anyways. Then it was time to continue with the plaster work. Once I had the plaster sheets installed, I needed to go along with the Stanley knife and cut the edge of the plaster, the original plaster and the new plaster on an edge, and then go along with this base coat that I had mixed up and fill all of that hole. I then needed to apply the plaster tape and add some more base coat over the top of the plaster tape to blend that in seamlessly, and continued around the entire kitchen doing the same thing. Once I had a fair bit of the base coat over the top, I would then also just go over that and smooth it out because I don't want to have too much of this base coat that I need to sand off afterwards. Here is a little bit of an example of what I meant with the knife. You just get a Stanley knife and just go along and scrape off the edges of both of those plaster sheets. While my base coat of plaster was drying, I then moved back on to painting the trim, and I started to apply my first coat of my semi-gloss enamel paint that I'm using for this trim. Whenever you decide to paint anything white, you do need to allow for more coats because painting things white and getting that solid finish of the white paint is a little bit more difficult than painting darker colors, and generally you require 3, sometimes 4 coats of white paint to get that really solid finish. I also rolled the first coat of paint on the pantry door. I ended up needing to let the first coat of plaster dry overnight, and then I came back in the next day with some sandpaper and I just sanded off all of the excess so that I could get that nice and smooth. Once I was happy and I decided that I had sanded enough off and got it to a flat surface, I needed to apply the top coat of plaster. So I just grabbed a spatula and went along and roughly applied it all onto the wall with the spatula first, before getting a trowel and then coming along and smoothing it all out to a really nice smooth consistency. Because this section of wall had a corner on it, I needed to go along with a corner trowel, which was made specifically for joins in plaster, and make sure that I got a really nice smooth edge where these 2 sheets of plaster met in the middle. I then just continued working my way around the kitchen and doing the same thing on all of the new sheets of plaster that I had added in. Next up, it's time to get painting. So I'm actually going to be keeping the wall color in the kitchen this same neutral color called Antique Ivory. I'm doing this because I'm actually going to be going quite bold with the cabinetry color, and I wanted to just keep the walls that nice warm neutral feel because I didn't want the kitchen then to be too overwhelming with too many different colors going on. I would just go around with a paintbrush and paint 1 coat on all of the edges, followed by getting out my roller and then rolling everything in the middle. Because this was already the color that was on the wall, I thankfully only needed to do 1 extra coat of paint just to give it a nice, fresh, new feeling.
So the kitchen is a bit of a mess at the moment. It tends to be a little bit of a collection zone, but for now we are up to the point where we've completed the demo and we just need to now add all of the new elements. So all of the old tile backsplash has been ripped out, and then we've added in all new plaster and then painted it and put a little bit of waterproofing on that so that we're ready to go with the new tiles.
This side of the kitchen, we removed the tiles, but we're not actually going to put tiles back on this side. We just plastered all of that because realistically, only thing anyone's going to use this for is to put like a kettle, maybe a toaster, that sort of thing. So you don't necessarily need a tile backsplash on that side, and we just thought it would be nice to just keep that whole side painted. The kitchen has now been painted, so all of the walls have been painted with the cream. We've done one coat of paint on this door, and this we've decided that we're going to paint white, the same color as the trim. So I've changed my plans a little bit. I was going to do the shaker style cabinetry on that door, and then I was going to paint that the green, the same color as the rest of the kitchen cabinetry, but I decided against that, and I have decided that I'm going to just have that as white. We've removed all the cabinetry from the doors, and I've actually taken the doors back to my house because I'm going to refinish them at my house. It's just a little bit easier because I have all of my tools there already. And then I don't need to bring all of my tools here every day, and I do a little bit less travel while I'm working on those doors. The benchtop is staying, as I mentioned earlier, which is great because it's actually in pretty good condition, the benchtop. And then down here on the back of the bench, I'm going to be adding some wood paneling. We got some amazing wood panels that are actually hardwood panels that we got on budget for $5 each. So they were in a bargain discontinued section, and we managed to pick up enough that we could do this entire bench the bottom of the bench. And it is going to look absolutely spectacular. So I was so over the moon when we came across those, and they literally had the exact amount that we were going to need to do the bench. So I need to be very careful when I do my cuts that I don't make any mistakes because I don't have any extras. So that's where I'm up to for now with this makeover and the kitchen space. I'm then going to get started on painting all of the inside of the cabinetry. Before I could get started with painting the inside of these cabinets, I needed to go along and fix all of the edges of the laminate. If you're not familiar with laminate cabinetry or laminate furniture, what it is a synthetic product that is made through the process of compressing plasticized sheets of paper together. The laminate veneer is then glued to the surface of the cabinetry, and inside that laminate surface is another type of wood, which could be MDF, particle board, chipboard, and the laminate is applied on top of that to give it a more seamless finish. The negative side to this is that the plastic laminate can then chip off the cabinetry, leaving you with the exposed chipboard surface. And typically chipboard is a very absorbent material, and if you do happen to get water damage onto this chipboard, it will then swell and expand, and you can no longer compress it back to its original size. Thankfully, the cabinetry that I'm working with doesn't have any water damage on it. It did have a lot of the old laminate chipping off, but I can replace that and then stop any water damage, hopefully from happening in the future, by sealing all of that off. What I did to repair this kitchen was get these pre-glued laminate strips and apply them onto all of the edges where there was damage. These strips are heat activated, so I needed to hold them in place and then hold the iron on them, and the heat from the iron would then activate the adhesive underneath and stick them to the surface. Once they were all glued on, I then just went along with a razor blade and cut off the excess to make these strips the same thickness as the cabinet, and then used a piece of sandpaper to smooth it off nice and flush. The cabinets were then ready for me to apply the paint. So I first off went in and applied a primer. I used the Taubman's 3-in-1 primer inside all of the cabinetry, and I'm going to be keeping the inside of the cabinets all white. There are so many different paint products that you can use to paint laminate cabinetry and laminate furniture, and they're slightly different depending on what country you live in. I personally chose to use a different paint on the inside of the cabinetry and a different paint on the outside of the cabinetry, only because on the inside of the cabinetry, I chose the same products that I typically use on furniture, and I know that they work really well. On the outside of the cabinetry, I did choose to use the products that were specifically made here in Australia for kitchen renovations, hoping that they would be a little bit more durable, and I will test these out and just see what I think of it at the end, and whether I prefer the products that I typically use or these products that were specifically made for this purpose. I also painted all of the overhead cabinetry as well. What you want for your primer is to be able to scratch the primer and have none of the primer scratch off. So you want to test your primer before you apply your top coat of paint to make sure that you've got the right durability in the primer and that the primer has stuck to the laminate surface. So what you're going to do is just get your fingernails or a nail, a scraper, something like that, and just rub it along on that surface that you have painted with your primer, and just make sure that nothing's going to come off onto your fingernails. So I've got a really nice primed surface there, and that's not scratching off. None of that is scratching off when I scratch that. So I'm ready to go with my top coat. I went along and applied the top coat of paint. Thankfully, because these cabinets were already white on the inside, once I painted on the primer and then I applied the first coat of white paint, I realized that I was probably going to get away with these 2 coats of paint. There may be some spots that I was going to need to apply a 3rd coat, but overall I was getting really great coverage from the white paint with just the 2 coats. So I just worked my way through the kitchen cabinet by cabinet, applying the top coat of the white enamel paint that I chose. So my primer is now drying and I am starting to work on these timber panels. So I've got the timber panels here. These are Tasmanian oak timber panels and they are absolutely stunning, and I picked them up for such a bargain price, and I hopefully, fingers crossed, have just enough to finish that back panel on the bench. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure it, and I'm going to make sure I triple check my measurements because I am very limited with the amount of timber that I have, and I don't want to get any of the measurements wrong because I don't have any backup panels. So I'm going to measure the bench, and because sometimes things are not exactly level already, so the back of the bench may have a bit of difference in the size in terms of the timber that I need to cut on one side of the bench versus the other side of the bench. So I'm going to make sure I measure each individual piece of timber and cut that perfectly to size so that I'm not then going to have a gap on one side of the bench where the levels were incorrect. So let's get started cutting. I would go out and measure the length of each individual piece and then come back in with that measurement, mark it on the piece of timber, check it again before I cut it, and then cut that piece down to size. I would then go out to the kitchen bench, hold it in place and nail it onto the wall, measure the next piece, and then go and cut the next piece, continuing the process over and over again. Because these panels are a beautiful Tasmanian oak hardwood, I'm going to be keeping them as the raw exposed wood look. There's no way I could have justified to myself to paint over the top of this beautiful timber. Plus, I also find that the timber is adding a beautiful warmth to the kitchen, and it just adds that extra element that the kitchen was really lacking, being plain and laminate. After I did each cut, I did get a piece of hand sandpaper and just sand that off to smooth so that there was no splinters on the end of the timber pieces. When installing the panels onto the back of the kitchen bench, I did need to be mindful of the length of the nails because I didn't want the nail to go through the laminate cabinets and then come out on the inside, and then you would see the back of the nails when you open the doors and on the inside of all of those cupboards. I just put in one nail very first just to check that it wasn't going to go through, but I also did an approximate measurement with the nail length going through the timber and in the cabinet and making sure that it wasn't going to go all the way through. The hardest part of the whole installation of these panels was getting the 2 end cuts. The first one, which was the cut that had to go around the corner, and the second one was the cut that I needed to have to line up perfectly with the end of the bench.
Today is kitchen tile splashback, and I'm so excited to put these tiles on the wall and see how they're going to turn out. Now, when you're tiling a kitchen splashback, there are so many different ways that you can tile it. You can stack horizontally. You can stack vertically. You can also lay them in a brick formation where you have them running half to the tile. So you put one full tile on, then the top tile is going to go halfway to that. You can run them in a herringbone pattern, or you can also do some different design features and styles with them where you run, say, two this way and then two this way. You name it, there's a never-ending amount of tile patterns that you can do when it comes to tiling your kitchen splashback. I'm going to put a few of them on the screen just so you can see what I'm talking about. But for ease of laying, I'm just going to be stacking them in a horizontal pattern because it's the easiest way to lay them and the fastest too.
I mixed up the tile glue by adding the glue into water and then using my drill and a drill bit to mix that all together until I got it to the right consistency. You want it to be thick enough to form a peak when you lift it out of the bucket. Once you've mixed up all the glue, you need to apply the glue onto the wall. You need to use a special trowel that's specifically designed for tile glue because it needs to have all of those little spaces and grooves in it to leave those spaces nicely in the glue, perfectly for the tiles to stick to the wall. If you use a plaster trowel, for example, that doesn't have all of those spaces, your tile glue is not going to work correctly when the tiles get stuck onto the wall. While I was applying the glue onto the wall and after I applied the first row of tiles, I decided to change my mind that I actually wanted to have these laid as a brick formation, even though I said a little bit earlier that I was going to just stack them horizontally because that's the easiest way to do it. I thought to myself, no, look, I really want to put these as a brick formation and have it stand out as a little bit more of a feature because I am keeping the original bench top. These tiles now have the opportunity to be a little bit of a wow factor in this space. So what this meant was that there's going to be quite a few more cuts that I needed to do in order to lay the tiles because every second row of tiles needed to start with a half cut tile. I then also needed to cut all the tiles down on the other end because I needed to work around the window frame. To cut the tiles, I used a diamond blade on an angle grinder because this was the easiest way to cut the ceramic tiles. I do also have a manual tile cutter, but I personally found that it was easier to cut them down with the diamond blade on the angle grinder and then just use a stone to smooth off those edges. I kept going with this particular section, working all the way up to the height that I marked out that I needed to go with the tiles. And then once I had the tiles at the height that I wanted them, I just wiped off the excess glue so that wasn't going to dry on the wall and be there through the paint. I moved on to the next section, and the hardest part about this section was getting the levels correct. This first row of tiles was super important that I got the level correct. So what I did is got out my laser level and marked where that first row needed to go. And what it meant is that there was going to be a fairly big space on one end because my bench top was not flat, and I was going to need to just add a little bit more silicone on one end between the tiles and the bench top, and the gap on the other end would be a little bit smaller. I continued on with my brick formation, laying every second row starting with a half tile, working along with the full tiles until I got to the other end and then cutting it down to size. Underneath the window here, I needed to do cuts the opposite direction, so the full length of the tile, so that I could fit the tile here underneath the window frame. When I was installing these tiles under the window frame, I also back-butted the tiles, and I did this on quite a few locations where I found that I needed a little bit of extra tile glue to help these stick to the wall. This last section here required the most amount of cuts because I actually required cuts pretty much the whole way through to keep my brick pattern and making sure that I had that half row. And even though the window frame was there and my first tile in the section wasn't a full half, I still needed to make sure the pattern lined up. And you need to be sure to use these metal tile ends on all of the edges of the tiles.
I'm back at my house and I'm now going to get started working on these doors. What I'm going to be doing with the doors and the drawers is I'm going to be painting them all and adding some framing as an extra detail. So what I'm going to get started with is I'm going to start off by removing the old handles. I'm then going to repair any damage in the laminate because a lot of the laminate has been chipped off the side of these doors and you'll see that it's just peeling off. Now, I don't want that laminate to be peeling off, so I'm actually going to peel these strips off and then iron on some new laminate to all of the damaged areas just to make sure that that's going to be nice and secure. And then once I've done that, I am going to scuff sand all of the fronts and the sides of these doors because I'm going to be painting both sides of the doors. And then once they have all been scuff sanded, I can build the frame. I've got these beautiful thin timber strips that I'm going to use to cut on 45-degree angles and frame out these doors just to give it a little bit more dimension and make it look a little bit more unusual and outside the box because plain laminate cabinets can come across as really boring and I just wanted to do something a little bit different. So I'm going to be using that to frame out the doors. I'm then going to apply all of the primer onto the doors and 2 coats of paint. And we're going to be using the stunning green color for this kitchen and I can't wait to see how it's going to turn out. Let's dive into working on these doors.
Of course, we're going to be starting off with all the preparation work, and I actually had to spend a whole lot of time to remove the damaged laminate strips on the edge. Some of them just peeled off really well, but other ones were half glued, half not glued, and I had to get a scraper out and really pull hard with the scraper to remove that old laminate. Every time I came across a strip that just peeled straight off, I breathed a sigh of relief. I also needed to give the doors a really good deep clean. So I've got my degreaser and I'm spraying that on, scrubbing it down with a scourer and then wiping it clean with a dry cloth. Then I just had to repeat the process over and over again until I had cleaned and peeled off the laminate on all 17 doors. Then I needed to do the same thing with the 4 drawer fronts. I'm not sure why the drawers were so much worse condition than the doors, but with the drawers, I pretty much needed to remove the laminate strip on all 4 edges of every drawer. And I also had to clean all the inside of the drawers, the front of the drawers, and then scuff sand the front of the drawers as well. I mixed up some builder's bog, which in America is called Bondo. Basically, it's a 2-part putty that you mix together, and the red component that I'm mixing in is the hardener. So the amount of hardener that I put in means that it's either going to dry faster or slower. So I mixed this up and then I filled all of the old hardware holes with this putty. I filled the handle holes on both sides of the doors. I also filled any other damage to the doors. So if there was any chips or kicks or marks or dints, those sorts of things that I needed to fill. And then I also filled the handles on the drawer fronts. I let it dry for about 45 minutes to an hour, and then I came in with my orbital sander and I sanded off all of the excess of that hardener and the putty so that all the doors and drawers were then nice and flat and flush. Next up was the laminate strips. Now, it is a fairly simple process, but this is actually probably one of my least favorite components of the kitchen, applying all of these new laminate strips to the edges of the doors and the drawers. I would just cut them down to size, hold them in place, and use the baking paper so that the iron didn't burn the strip, and then hold the iron in place to activate the glue and work my way slowly along each strip of the doors. Once the strips were all glued on, I then needed to use the razor blade to cut it down to size, flush again, and use the sandpaper to smooth it all off. This process actually took me about 3 hours to do all of the 17 doors and the 4 drawers with this edge stripping. So when the time came to move on to framing out the doors, I was so excited that I was finished with the laminate strips.
I'm going to talk you through the whole process of framing out one of these doors. I am repeating the same process on all of the doors so that all of the doors have both an edging frame and then a beading around the inside of that. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to start off using the edging frame around the door, and then use the beading and go around the inside of that. What I first want to do is get the measurements for my door. Now I can either do this with a tape measure, or what I'm doing is I'm just measuring the door up against this frame, and then I'm just going to cut that down to size based on where I mark it out. It really doesn't matter which way you do, it's up to you which one you want to go with. So I'm just going to hold this up against the door, and I'm going to get the top measurement, which is going to be going across here. So I'm just going to mark where that measurement is. And then I'm going to take it over to my drop saw, and I am going to cut that measurement. So I want to make sure that I've got the saw on 0% so that I've got that in a straight line. And then I'm just going to sit this in here where I've got the line that I've just marked lined up perfectly. I have a laser guide on this drop saw, so it's really easy to get that nice and straight, and I'm just going to cut that. So that's going to be my top. Now, my top and bottom of the doors, I would hope, are square. So you could individually measure your doors if you're concerned that they're not going to be the same on the top and the bottom. But for the sake of this, I've just been using the same measurement for the top and the bottom. So I just take that first one that I have cut and measure it up against the other one. And then I am going to cut that the same length. So that's my top and bottom. Now I need to get the lengthwise for the sides. So I'm just going to come across here and get that measurement. Hold it up. You can use your finger to make sure it is flush on the ends and mark your measurement. So then I'm going to cut this one. And I'm going to repeat the same thing I did with the top and bottom with the sides. So I'm just going to place that one on top, mark out where it gets to, and then cut that. Now that I've got the two sides and the top and bottom cut down to size, I need to start to cut the 45-degree angles. So what I'm going to be doing is cutting a 45 on one end and a 45 on the opposite end, and then we're going to join them up as a frame around this door. I have just been sitting them on top of each other and cutting them together just to make it a little bit easier for myself and slightly quicker, just lining them up and then cutting them on top of one another. What I need to do is I need to turn my saw to the 45 degree. So I'm going to turn that to the 45, making sure I've got that exactly on the 45-degree angle. Because if it's not right and my 45 is off, then my cuts are going to be off and then my square's not going to end up right. So I'm just going to make sure that that's on the 45 there, and then I'm going to sit this onto my saw. Then what I'm going to do here is make sure that the angle of my laser lines up perfectly with this top corner. So I'm cutting off this corner here, and when I've got my laser guide on my saw, I want to make sure that that lines up perfectly with this corner. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to sit that in place, lining that up perfectly with the corner. And once I'm happy with that, I'm just going to hold that in place and drop down. So while my saw is facing this direction, I am going to also cut the other pieces just to make it easier, so I'm not going back and forth swapping the saw over so many times. I'm going to sit this in place, making sure once again that I line up my laser perfectly with that corner, and then I'm going to drop it down. Beautiful. Now that I've got that end cut, I need to cut the opposite end. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn my saw around to the opposite 45. I'm just going to move that all the way around until that's sitting on that opposite 45. And then once I've got that on the opposite 45, I'm going to cut the other end. Now, what you need to be mindful of here is the direction that the saw is going. So if I was to sit this down and cut that straight away, I would not necessarily have the angles correct. So what I need to have is one this direction and one this direction. And so if I wasn't to have this in the correct position and I flipped it over, I would actually end up having two the same direction. So you would see here that I would have two cuts heading the same direction. And if I do that, then I'm not going to be able to make a frame. So I need to make sure that when I have this in position, I'm holding it the correct way, and I flipped it over so that I'm going to have my cut going the opposite direction perfectly. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to hold that in position, making sure that I've got my laser guide correct and that I've got the laser joined up with the corner of that side, and then I'm going to drop that down. So now you'll see I've got two cuts in the opposite direction. So one is facing one way and one is facing the other. I can then place those on the sides of my door. Now what I need to do is take the other two pieces and cut the opposite end. So making sure that I've got them facing the right direction, I am going to then get my cut to make sure it goes the right way, line it up with my laser guide, and then drop it down. So now that I've got my top and bottom, I can just slide those in position to create my frame. So that's the outside frame of my door. So what I do is I actually put that in position and get that stuck down. And then I'm going to, once I've got that in position, cut the inside beading. I am using liquid nails and also my brad nailer to attach these doors. So I'm just going to swap over the silicone gun to my liquid nails. I'm going to add some liquid nails to the back of this piece. Realistically, either way would be fine, using just liquid nails or using just the brad nails. But if you're using just liquid nails, it does take a little while to set, so it can be hard to hold it in position. If you're going to use just the liquid nails, you would need to clamp this in position until the glue has dried. So I'm just going to line that up perfectly with the top and the bottom of the door. And then once I've got that in position, I'm going to take my brad nailer and hold that down in position. And then I'm just going to fire that nail. So I'm putting 3 nails on each side. So now that's firmly in position there. It's not going to go anywhere. It's going to give that glue a chance to dry, and I have done that side. So I'm just going to rotate this around, and I'm going to continue to do the same on each of these angles, making sure that I've got them correct as I'm installing them. Sometimes you need to hold them all together and just make sure they're going to work out. Inside the brad nailer, I am using 18 gauge 20mm nails. I needed to be careful with the size of the nails that I wasn't going to go through the doors and come out the other side. So when I was trying to decide what nails I was going to use, I just held this up against these pieces to see that I was going to have this fully through the trim that I'm adding and then also into the door, but it wasn't going to be deep enough that it was going to go all the way through the laminate doors out the other side. So just make sure that when you're selecting the nails, you select the correct depth of the nails so that you're not going to have any issues with that coming through on the other side. Perfect time to change my nails over while I'm explaining this. There's hardly any nails left here. You're just going to get your nails, you're going to slide them into the brad nailer up the front, making sure that the tip of the nail faces the base. So you're going to drive the nails in. So you want the head of the nail facing the opposite direction. And then you're just going to slide that back on again, making sure that whenever you're changing the nails or putting new nails in, you have your battery out. You don't want to have the battery in and have it misfire while you are putting new nails in. Adding the battery back on again, and then I can continue adding this frame. So adding some liquid nails on the back of the frame. Putting that in position. And then once that is positioned and I am happy with it, I am going to nail it on. Spinning it around. I like to do the top and the bottom and then put the other side in last, generally. And see, I would say that's, you know, borderline a little bit too long. So I would probably even potentially take that off and just trim that down marginally. Sometimes the doors are not exactly plumb. They're not exactly square. And it's better to just trim it down a little bit. Have a little bit of a gap that you can fill with no more nails. So no more gaps. All right, adding this last side on. Getting it in position. Making sure that everything is good before I nail these last two sides down. So that one I'm happy with. So I'm just going to nail that in position. And this one is a little bit too long, so we're going to trim it down a bit. Sometimes you might find that your 45-degree angles don't line up perfectly. You know, it is a little bit of a tricky game to try and get all of those angles perfect and have them like flush without any gaps there. The more you practice it, the easier it will get. And I'm definitely not going to say that I am a pro at this. I do cut my 45s and I'm capable of getting them into a frame, but it's not perfect. Once we've got my 45s on and I've got that initial frame, you could leave it like that. If you wanted a really modern look, you could just have this trim around there and then add some no more gaps on the inside of this and have it as a square trim. That's definitely possible. And in certain circumstances, you might find that that's more to the style of your home. But I just wanted to finish it off, and the home that I'm renovating at the moment has got kind of a bit of a colonial kind of feel, and it is a little bit more traditional. It's not necessarily super modern. We've got crisscross windows and some beautiful features in there. And I thought that this beading would just add that extra element to this. So I'm just going to measure down the size of my trim. Now what I do here is I just add a couple of mil, because when I cut my 45s on the end of this, it does take a little bit off this. So if you cut it down to the perfect length of this, it will then end up shortening as you cut off the 45s. So I'm just going to turn my saw back around to 0. Put this in place and then drop that down. Doing the same thing again, I am just using both sides, measurements the same, and cutting at the same length. You did notice that I trimmed down one of those sides, but if these need trimming down, that's okay. I'll just trim them down once I've cut them to size and cut the 45s. I'd rather them to be too big than too short. And once again, I'm not being super precise because I am just measuring off the doors and not using a tape measure. You could definitely use a tape measure to measure this more accurately. when cutting little pieces like this, you're going to have to make sure that you've got the right blade. You need a fine cuts blade, because if you have a rough cuts blade with not very many teeth, you're going to find that you're not going to get that cut down there very nice, and you're going to find that it may not even cut through, it might just splinter. So you do need to have a fairly fine blade with a lot of teeth on it to be able to cut. All right, now that I've got all of these cut to length, so that will fit in there, not quite, but once I cut those ends off, you'll see that it probably will fit. And if it doesn't quite fit, I'll just cut a little bit extra off. I'm going to do the same as what I did before and cut 2 45-degree angles. So I'm going to move this around to my 45, and I'm going to place this in position and cut the 45-degree angle on one end, making sure I have enough space to hold it. So with my hand, I want to make sure my hand is nowhere near the blade. In this instance, my cut on this end, I am just holding on this side. I need to make sure once again that I've got my piece lined up perfectly with my laser level on that 45-degree angle, and then I'm going to cut it down. Also making sure that you've got safety glasses on here, because when you're just cutting off a little triangle 45 piece on these tiny thin pieces of timber, they do fly everywhere. Okay, now that I've got all of the cuts on one end, I am going to turn my 45 the opposite direction. Again, making sure that I am going to be cutting this the right way so that my cut's going the opposite direction. So lining it up so that my 45 goes this way, and then placing this in position so that the 45 is going to go the other way, and then just cutting the ends off. You'll see here that these little tiny bits that I'm cutting off just fly. And now that I've got all those cut, I can see whether they will fit in position. So I'm just going to sit them inside my frame up against the edge there. There's this one on the opposite side. So both of those are fine, they fit in nicely. And then I'm just going to place my ends in, making sure that they fit also. So that one fits in there nicely. And then the same with this one, that's nice and flush. So now that I've got all of those cut, I'm just going to nail those in position. I'm not using liquid nails on this beading. It is very thin beading, and 3 nails in each of these is well and truly going to hold that securely in place. So what I do is I'm just getting the brad nailer, putting it down in place, and then holding those nails down. Making sure that when I'm pushing the nails in, I have this piece nice and flush with those edges. So going around doing that with all of them. Once again, you may find that you've got a little gap in your 45s, which is perfectly okay. When you are cutting those 45s, as I mentioned earlier, because you're cutting off a tiny little bit of timber, it does shrink these rods. So if you're wanting to get it perfect, you're going to need to allow that extra few mil. Alrighty, so the hard part is done, and I've got all of the framing done. Now we just need to fill all of the holes and gaps. So what I'm using is I am using Timbermate wood filler, and I'm using the Timbermate wood filler to fill all of those little nail holes, and then I am using No More Gaps to fill any of those other holes that we have going on in between all of the joins. So I'm just going around with this filler. I'm just using my finger to push it into all these little nail holes. So just making sure that you've got enough wood filler that you have completely covered the hole, and then you're going to have to come in and sand off the excess. I'm also sometimes using the wood filler on these corner sections. These internal corners I've been using No More Gaps, and the external corners, because these I can just sand flush, I have been using the wood filler.
And then once this all dries, I'm just going to come in with my orbital sander and just sand all the excess off. And then it will be perfectly prepared, ready to go to add the paint and the primer. I've already scuff sanded all of the doors internally. So all of these doors have already been scuff sanded before I added the framing so that I could thoroughly scuff sand them easily. So now I am going to swap my liquid nails over into my No More Gaps. This is really fast drying. It dries in 10 minutes and then it's paintable, but because I'm just going through and doing all of this on all of the doors first, doesn't really matter too much. So I'm just going to hold my No More Gaps over all of the sections and run a little line of beading along where I need to add the No More Gaps. I'm then going to take my finger and go back along that beading line and smooth it out. You need a little rag that you can wipe your finger on after you have smoothed out all those lines. You might want to remove any excess of the wood filler as well so that that's not going to fall into your No More Gaps. We want to make sure that nothing's going to land in our No More Gaps. It's going to get in the way. And then we're going to come along the external line of the door and run a line along there as well. And then along the front side of the door. All these little details that we're adding here are just going to make it look so much more professionally done and just make it look like it was meant to be there and that it hasn't been added afterwards. And there you have it. We have finished that door. So we're now going to let all of that dry, and then I'm going to continue framing out all of the other doors. And then once I have finally finished framing out all of the doors, I'm going to come back in and sand off all of this excess filler. Now that I'd completed all of the doors, I just had the 4 drawers to go. So I just repeated the same process, cutting down the square frame and then adding the beaded trim to the inside. But then all of a sudden I had this feeling in my mind that the doors were potentially going to have an issue opening. And I thought to myself, oh, I'm going to really have to go and test this out before I get much further in the process and before I paint the doors. So once I finished doing all of the framing of the drawers, I then had to go back to the house and test out and see whether I was in fact going to have an issue with the doors.
I'm back at the house today because I'm going to be doing a couple of finishing touches here. I'm going to be adding the grout to the tiles, and I've chosen to use a black grout. Now, I was a little bit hesitant about this because the black grout is really going to show up any problems when I laid my tiles. If there's any sections where it is a little bit uneven or anything like that, that black grout is going to really show that up. So hopefully, fingers crossed, it's going to turn out looking amazing. But the black grout is also just going to help make these tiles and the pattern that I've laid the tiles really stand out. You might have noticed that I ended up deciding that I was going to do a brick pattern and stack them like bricks, where I start with a half tile on every second row so that they ended up lining up with the half tile in the middle of the other tile. And the pattern that I've chose actually really makes this kitchen look a lot more modern, and I love the fact that I chose to do the brick pattern. So we're going to be installing the black grout. I'm also going to putting the wood filler on the back of the kitchen bench. So I'm going to fill all the little nail holes where I applied the wood to the back of the bench with wood filler, and then once that's dried, I'm going to sand off the excess and just put a clear varnish over the top of that wood filler. The other thing that I am here today at the house for is because I discovered that I'm actually going to have a little bit of an issue with the framing I've added around the doors. I really like how it's turning out and it looks spectacular, but as I was thinking it a little bit through, because the kitchen and the cabinetry was already made, I wasn't going to be able to allow enough space between the doors to enable the doors to open correctly without crashing into each other. Now, I've brought these doors over here so that I could test this out and show you what I mean, but also so that I can try and come up with a solution that means that these doors are not then going to crash into each other as they open. When I open the door, you'll see here that I'm able to open the door almost all the way, but when it gets to 3/4 of the way open, it actually crashes into the hinge of the other door. So when this door goes on there, I'm going to then open this door and it's not actually going to be able to fully open. And I really don't want that to happen. And I don't want these doors to be stuck in this 3/4 position. I want to be able to open them fully. So I'm going to need to come up with a fix for this, and it might be a little bit tricky.
I've never been one for sitting around and doing not much, and so while I was thinking about what I was going to do to try and fix the doors, I thought, why not grout the tiles at the same time? So I grabbed out the black grout and the grout trowel and I just started to push the grout in between all of these tiles. I needed to make sure that I had enough grout that it was completely filling up all of these little grooves and not leaving it too empty. The grout's going to go in all of the grooves, even the grooves up against where I've added these metal edge strips. The only place that I'm not going to put the grout is around the window frame because that's going to have silicone added there. Once I finished each section, I went back and just wiped off the bench. Because I am keeping these original bench tops, I didn't want to have the black grout potentially leave any stain on the bench tops or go hard on there. So it was just easier to clean off the bench tops as I went. Once I finished putting all of the grout in all of these cracks, I went back in with a sponge and removed the bulk of the excess that was on all of the tiles, just leaving the actual grout lines and not wiping those clear yet. However, I did actually forget to press record, so I didn't film that. So now what you'll be seeing here is me going back through with a little bit of a scrubber and just scrubbing off all of the grout lines and just removing a little bit of the extra grout because I felt like it was too thick and I wanted to have them a little bit thinner, so I just went along and scrubbed them down and then wiped them clean with a dry towel. If you're new to installing grout, I probably wouldn't choose black as the first color to do because it is going to show up the most mistakes. If you have a lighter color grout, it is a little bit more forgiving and it's not going to be as obvious if you have too much grout in one section, if it's really thick, or if you make a mistake where you've removed too much grout in some sections. So I'd try and use a lighter color if you're a beginner, but if you've done grouting a few times, it's not difficult at all to use the black grout. You just need to look back over what it is that you have done to make sure that it's not looking too thick in any of the sections. Now it is finally time to paint the outside of the cabinetry, and I'm using the Dulux Renovation range primer to paint all of the doors and the kickboard and the edge of the cabinetry. This primer is in two parts, so you just need to mix the second part into the main tin and stir that really well in together because the second component is the hardener. Now, once that's all mixed in together, you can start painting it onto the cabinetry. All of the sections that are still blue, which is the outside framing of the cabinetry, is going to be painted with this laminate paint. So I'm applying the primer onto all of those sections. Worked my way around all of the kitchen applying this primer, but unfortunately it's not very fun to watch this particular component of painting because the primer is clear and you can barely even see the primer, so you don't actually get to see what I'm painting. There was also a little bit of the edge strips on the overheads that needed to be painted, so I just jumped up on the bench and painted on the primer to all of those edge pieces of the overhead cabinets as well. Now it was time to fill in all of the little nail holes in these wood panels that I added to the back of the bench. Because I'm going to be keeping these as raw exposed wood, I needed to get a wood filler that was as close as possible to the color of the timber. And so I actually got a Tasmanian oak hardwood filler, and it did blend very nicely with the timber, and it is almost unnoticeable once we applied the top coat onto this timber. Now I have such a love-hate relationship with masking tape, and majority of the time I actually prefer not to apply masking tape. But I thought to myself, no, look, the new flooring has gone in and I'm going to try and protect it as much as possible. So I'm going to put the masking tape in around the floor. And then I also applied the masking tape to the top of the overhead cabinets. However, as I got a little bit further in and once I started to remove the masking tape, I did definitely decide that this was a regret. So personal preference would be that if I did it again, I would not apply masking tape. Let's see the paint. This is the stunning green that I have chosen for the cabinetry, and it actually looks a fair bit lighter in the can than it does on the cabinets. But I started to paint the green on to all of the kickboards in the kitchen, and as soon as I started to paint it on, I knew that I was going to love this color. A green kitchen is not for everyone, but green is not a color that's really outside the box. It is a little bit more bold than the classic standard color kitchens such as a white or a black, but I wanted to do something a little bit different, but something that was still going to suit majority of people, because we are putting this house on the market to sell, and we do want to have it so that the most amount of people are going to enjoy the kitchen and feel really at home in this property, but I still didn't want to have a really boring space. So it will be interesting to see once I finish the kitchen and show you the end result, how many of you love the color and the choices that I made, to see whether it is going to be a really popular choice when it comes to purchasers looking at the property. I finished painting on the first coat of green and let that dry overnight, and then came back in the next day and grabbed out my orbital sander and just went over all of the wood filler that I've added on to the back of this timber bench to sand off all of the excess filler. I gave it all a dust down to make sure that there was going to be no dust on there when I applied my clear coat of paint. And then I grabbed out this clear polyurethane paint and I applied one coat onto all of the timber. When you paint on a clear polyurethane, you will notice that the timber darkens a little bit, but in this instance, I actually didn't mind the timber darkening because it just brought in a little bit more warmth. But if you did have a problem with dark timber and you didn't want the timber to darken a little bit, you would need to apply either a paint wash or a lime wash onto there to try and hold the lighter color in the timber before applying the clear varnish over the top. Now you're going to see what I mean when I regret using the masking tape, because I peeled the masking tape off and it was just so uneven. I really wish I had have just not used the masking tape and just cut in like I normally do, because I am very good at cutting in, not to try and, toot my own horn, but I have been painting for a very long time and my cutting in is really quite good. So I don't find that I get very much paint anywhere and I would have got a much better line. And now I'm going to have to go back and cut in over the top of this anyways to try and fix the really uneven mess that was left from the masking tape. Now, let's fix the frames on the cabinet doors where I made the mistake, and in order to do this, I needed to enlist the help of my dad. When I thought about what I needed to do in order to fix these cabinets, I worked out that I needed to have the edge point the same thickness as what the door used to be. So on the very edge of the door, it needed to be the original thickness, and then the frame needed to be built out further in from the door and the edge of the door. So what I decided that I was going to need to do was cut the door down on a 45-degree angle so that the edge is the original thickness and then it bevels in towards the center of the door. You'll be able to see here in the close-up what I mean. So we set the saw up so that the edge of the saw was at the edge of the cabinet, and then it started to cut in on an angle from there. We then just simply fed all of the doors on each side through the table saw so that they would all come out at exactly the same depth. I did initially question whether I would be able to do a router trim and use the router to cut off a trim around the edge, but it just wasn't going to be able to get deep enough, and that's why I had to enlist my dad's help, because I don't personally have a table saw and I needed to borrow his table saw to be able to get the end effect that I wanted. Although the drawers didn't have the same problem, I did the same edging on the front of the drawers so that all of the cabinetry would match nicely. But this mistake actually ended up benefiting me and was really more of a happy accident, because I actually liked the end result and these beautiful angled edges more than I liked my original design, and I'm so looking forward to seeing how it turns out. Now that I've got the beveled edge on all of the edges of the doors and the drawers, it was just time to do another sand before I could go ahead and paint these doors. I needed to sand off the excess wood filler and then also do a sand along that edge that we'd just cut, because a rough cut with a saw blade, even though I did use a really detailed saw blade, is still not going to be nice and smooth, and so I needed to come in with a 120 grit sandpaper and just smooth off those edges that we'd made. It's finally paint time for the doors, and so to make it a little bit easier for myself, I set up these trestle tables and then laid out all of the doors on top of the trestle tables for me to paint. I used a paintbrush and a roller to paint the clear primer onto all of the door fronts and drawer fronts. I used the paintbrush to go around all of the edges and then all of the trim, and then we'll grab the roller and use the roller to paint everything in the middle. Once I had the primer on one side of all of the door fronts, I then painted on the primer using a spray can of paint to all of the inside of the drawers. The inside of the drawers are going to be white because then they're going to match the rest of the cabinetry and the inside of the cabinets that I painted white. I'm just using a can of spray paint for the primer here because it's a little bit easier and a little bit faster. I then flipped all the doors over and painted on the primer to the other side of the doors. This primer is pretty good because it only takes 1 hour to touch dry, so I was able to flip them over and paint the other side pretty quickly. Again, after letting the primer dry, I was then able to come in with my green paint and roll on the first coat of paint. As soon as it started to hit the doors, it was starting to look absolutely fantastic, and I knew I had made the right decision with this green paint. I let the first coat of green paint dry overnight, and then I came out the next day and flipped all of the doors over so that I could paint the green on the other side. As I started to paint the green on and cover all of this trim, I could see that it was really going to start paying off for me, and the amount of time and effort that I'd put into painting all of these doors was going to be beneficial, although I'm not sure that I should have quite spent so much time and effort on the framing, but it does look really great. I am finally so close to the finish line, but it has been a long project, and let me tell you, it probably isn't worth all the effort that I've put into it. I am really hoping that once I add these doors onto the kitchen, it is going to look absolutely spectacular, but I have spent countless hours framing out all of these doors, and I just don't think I'm going to get enough wow factor for the amount of time and effort that I've put into it. So I probably wouldn't recommend you go out and frame all of your laminate doors unless you have a whole lot of time that you want to put into it that you don't necessarily need. But if you are doing this project and you're wanting to get the project done reasonably quickly and transform the look and feel of your kitchen, you're probably going to get a similar impact just by painting these doors as opposed to framing them all out, adding the trim and all of those details. I'm not sure whether we're going to get the required amount of impact, but you never know. I might put the doors on and absolutely love how it turns out. So today what I need to do is add the final coat on both sides of the doors. I'm going to paint one side of the doors, give it the 4 hours it needs to be touched dry, flip the doors over, and then paint the other side of the doors. Once the doors are all painted, the only things I have left to do are add the new handles and then put the doors back on the cabinetry, and the kitchen is all finished, and I can finally share with you the end result and actually see for myself how it turns out. I've still got one final coat of paint to do on the front of these doors with the green, but before I do the final coat of paint, I'm just wanting to build myself a little jig to be able to install all of these door handles at the exact same spot on all of the doors, because the idea is that I want to make sure that my handles are going to be in the exact same location, and then I'm not going to have any issues when it comes to making them at different locations or different heights or not exactly at the same spot on each of the doors. So what I've done here is I've just built a little right angle frame that I'm using to sit over the door. And then I've got this piece of wood that I'm going to use up against this right angle frame, and I'm going to drill my holes in this so I know exactly where I need to drill through for each of these doors, and it's going to be the same on each of the doors. So I'm just measuring here and I'm just marking where I need to put these handles and where I need to drill my hole. And then I'm going to drill the holes on this, staple that all together with my nail gun, and then that's going to be a nice little jig that I can just use to put all of these door handles on the doors. I'm just going to measure the distance across from here before I drill it to make sure that they're in line, because they do look a little bit sus to me when I've just done them by eye. Be across a little bit. So it needs to come across to there. Alrighty. So then I'll drill those holes and then I'll nail that onto there, and then this will be my guide that I'm going to use to just drill all of the holes. My jig's all built and I ended up having to build two, one for a right hand side handle and one for a left hand side handle, depending on which side of the door the handle needed to go on. So I just set the jig in place, drilled through, and then used my impact drill just to install these handles on the doors. I also had to drill the holes on the drawers and then install the handles onto the 4 drawer fronts. You'll be able to see here what I mean about holding the jig on the door and then using the drill to just drill straight through those 2 holes. Now that all the door handles were on, it was time to put all of the doors back on the hinges and reattach the cabinetry all back together again. So I would just slide the hinge into the holes and then use the drill to tighten up the screws. Sometimes I had to give the hinges a little bit of a hit with a hammer just to encourage them back into the holes, but after I fixed all of these doors with cutting off that extra trim, the doors all now fit perfectly onto the hinges and completely open. So now, after all of that, let's go back and have another look at where we started and what this kitchen looked like when we first began this transformation. And now, the moment you have all been waiting for, let's see the end result and what it turned out like. If you want to know any more information about any of the products or tools I used in this makeover, they are all linked down in the description for you. And you can see here that I did in fact fix these doors perfectly and now they open no issue. I have finally finished this kitchen transformation and it looks amazing, but let me tell you, I am very excited to see the end of this project. It's not that I didn't enjoy this project, I really did, and I really enjoyed the end result, but it did take a lot more than what I was hoping to, and the amount of time that I spent on it was a lot more than what I initially thought. On the next kitchen, I'm definitely going to rethink the framing that I chose to do on these cabinets because I still don't believe it looks as good as it should for the amount of time and effort that I've put into it. I really like the look and how I've achieved the look, but there is other alternatives to be able to create a fun etched look on the doors, and I probably would use my router to create a design or do something a little bit different next time. If you are wanting to have a go at framing out the doors and you love the look and feel of these doors, you can definitely do that. Don't try and let me discourage you, but I just want you to go into it knowing that it is a huge amount of work. And at the end of the day, you're not really upgrading the cabinets too much because you still do have the original cabinetry that you were working with. I hope that you absolutely loved this video and coming along on the journey with me as I transformed this kitchen and that you've learned something along the way. If you have enjoyed this video, it would be really helpful for me if you could leave me a comment and just let me know what you thought of it, because then I can help create better videos for you in the future, and it also helps boost this video a little bit. Next week, we are going to be doing another video and an episode where we're just going to fill in all of the blanks that I've been working on throughout the rest of the house as I've been working on this makeover. So stay tuned for the next episode.